Introduction to the Old Testament, Unit 23, the Prophets in the 7th and 6th centuries. We open with Obadiah. This is the shortest book in the Old Testament. It is a difficult one to place a date of writing. There may have been two different events that are background to this. One is the attack on Jerusalem by the Philistines and the Arabs in 844, and the other is the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 587. It has been dated from 850 to 400 BC, and perhaps the best date that we can give to it would be somewhere around the fall of Jerusalem. Edom is the main topic of this volume. The message against Edom is that they are going to be punished because of their attitude towards Judah. They joined the enemy in trying to destroy the country of Judah. So the message is that Yahweh is against Edom. The key ideas in the book of Obadiah is the sovereignty of God, the principle of retribution, and the restoration of Israel. The purpose of the book of Obadiah is to pronounce divine judgment against the nation of Edom for their role in assisting the Babylonians in the conquest of Judah, and to announce the future divine restoration of the people of Israel. The main themes that are discussed in this book is pride, that's the pride of Edom that led to their downfall, lex talionis, which is the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, universal judgment, and then the restoration of Israel. The theme of divine presence in the book of Obadiah is implicit in the deliverance and holiness associated with Mount Zion. The book begins, "This is what the sovereign Lord says about Edom." Now, the only background we have for this is the first verse, which says it's the vision of Obadiah. This term, translated vision, is the same one that Isaiah saw and others saw. It occurs 3 or 4 times in the introduction of a prophetic message. "We have heard a message from the Lord. An envoy was sent to the nations to say, 'Rise, and let us go against her for battle. See, I will make you small among the nations. You will be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights. You who say to yourself, who can bring us down to the ground? Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord." And then there is an illustration of this, and this also is found in Jeremiah, and it's difficult to know which one of them came first. In verse 5, "If thieves came to you, if robbers in the night, oh, what a disaster awaits you. Would they not steal only as much as they wanted? If grape pickers came to you, would they not leave a few grapes? But how Esau will be ransacked, his hidden treasures pillaged. All your allies will force you to the border. Your friends will deceive and overpower you. Those who eat your bread will set a trap for you, but you will not detect it." And then it goes on to say, "In that day, declares the Lord, will I not destroy the wise men of Edom men of understanding in the mountains of Esau. Your warriors, O Teman, will be terrified, and everyone in Esau's mountains will be cut down in the slaughter. Because of the violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame. You will be destroyed forever. So that is the reason that the prophecy comes against Edom, is because of their treatment of their brothers, the people of Judah. Edom will be completely gone, and it shows the ultimate triumph of Yahweh over that nation. The pride of Edom has distorted reality and blinds people to the truth. And this eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, the lex talionis, is frequently mentioned in the Old Testament. And this is where you are going to do to them as they have done to others. And there's going to be universal judgment. Verses 15 and 16, the day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. That's your lex talionis. Your deeds will return upon your own head. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and be as if they had never been. So those two verses sum up what God is going to do against Edom. This is the statement that characterizes the day of the Lord. Now, the day of the Lord is when God is going to take action. Oftentimes, the people of Judah mention the day of the Lord, but think it's a good day. God is going to bless them. But most of the time, it's a day in which God is going to judge them. And here it is against Edom, and God is going to bring judgment against Edom. Now that basically is the message of Obadiah. And now we turn to another of the prophets, and that is Nahum. Now, Nahum is a book that Jonah would like to have written, because it is the destruction of Nineveh, the Assyrian force that did so much trouble for Judah. Now with Nahum, we have the impending judgment of Nineveh and Judah's coming release from the power of the Assyrian Empire. The purpose of the book of Nahum is to pronounce the doom of Nineveh. This was not just a case of the ebb and flow of history, but the action of the Lord's punishment against Nineveh. He announced Nineveh's doom, and he would accomplish it. Now, the major theme, of course, in this book is Assyria and the Old Testament. The chronological information is usually given in the superscription, but in this case, it merely says an oracle concerning Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. So it doesn't give us any information about when it was written. We just know that it would have been after 663, because it mentions that Thebes had fallen, and that is when the Assyrians took the city of Thebes in Egypt. And so probably around 655 or 650 BC is a likely time for the writing of the book of Nahum. We know that it has to be before the destruction of the city of Nineveh. Otherwise, it would not be the type of prophecy that tells us what is going to happen. The book of Nahum begins with a partial psalm, and this seems to be an acrostic psalm, one that follows with the successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And it's speaking about God, the judgment of God. It says that the Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord takes vengeance and is filled with wrath. The Lord takes vengeance on his foes and maintains his wrath against his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power. He will not leave the guilty unpunished. His way is in the whirlwind and the storm, and clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and dries it up. He makes all the rivers run dry. Bashan and Carmel wither, and the blossoms of Lebanon fade. Now you notice that this is a description of what Yahweh normally does. So this is describing his character. Then we are given the doom of Nineveh and the deliverance of Judah in the next section. Beginning with verse 9 in chapter 1, it says, "Whatever they plot against the Lord, he will bring to an end. Trouble will not come a second time. They will be entangled among thorns and drunk from their wine. They will be consumed like dry stubble. From you, O Nineveh, has one come forth who plots evil against the Lord and counsels wickedness." And so Nineveh and the Assyrian Empire are going to be destroyed, and it is going to be done by Yahweh. As in verse 12 it says, "This is what the Lord says, although they are unscathed and numerous, they will be cut down and pass away. Although I have afflicted you, O Judah, I will afflict you no more. Now I will break their yoke from your neck and tear your shackles away." So he is going to free Judah from the power of the Assyrians. And in verse 14 it says, "The Lord has given a command concerning you, Nineveh. You will have no descendants to bear your name. I will destroy the carved images and cast idols that are in the temple of your gods. I will prepare your grave, for you are vile." And then in the next verse, in verse 15, "Look there on the mountains, the feet of one who brings good news." And of course, this is the news about the fall of Nineveh. "Who proclaims peace. Celebrate your festivals, O Judah, and fulfill your vows. No more will the wicked invade you. They will be completely destroyed." So then we have, after this, the description of the siege of Nineveh. And this is interesting because it is almost staccato. It is things that are happening quickly. For instance, in chapter 3, "Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims, the crack of whips, the clatter of wheels, galloping horses, jolting chariots, charging cavalry, flashing swords, and glittering spears. Many casualties, piles of dead, bodies without number, people stumbling over the corpses, all because of the wanton lust of a harlot, alluring the mistress of sorceries, who enslaved nations by her prostitution and peoples by her witchcraft." And so God says that he is against Nineveh. In verse 8 of chapter 3, it mentions, "Are you better than Thebes, situated on the Nile, with water around her?" And I mentioned that this was the time that the Assyrians attacked the city of Thebes in Egypt. And so this gives us a date that it could not have been written before, because we have now the description of that, and that was in 663 BC. Now, the purpose and message of the book of Nahum is to pronounce the doom of Nineveh, and it also addresses Judah, because Judah now is going to be free from the power of the Assyrians. To prepare for the siege, it mentions in verse 14 in chapter 3, draw water for the siege. Water is always important, water and food, and then the material to patch up holes that are made in the wall. So it says, draw water for the siege, strengthen your defenses, work the clay, tread the mortar, repair the brickwork. It's interesting that it mentions during the time of Hezekiah, when the Assyrians, this same group, were trying to besiege Jerusalem, and it says they tore down some of the houses to strengthen the wall of the city. And so that is what they are suggesting here, that you repair the brickwork. In verse 16, you have increased the number of your merchants till they are more than the stars of the sky. But like locusts, they strip the land and then fly away. Your guards are like locusts, your officials like swarms of locusts that settle in the walls on a cold day. But when the sun appears, they fly away, and no one knows where. Now, the Assyrians did not have a lot of raw materials, and they sent out their merchants to gain this material from other countries. And so that's what they're mentioning here, that they have so many of these merchants, thousands of them, in most every fortified city in the ancient East. And then it ends by saying in verse 19, nothing can heal your wound, your injury is fatal. Everyone who hears the news about you claps his hands at your fall, for who has not felt your endless cruelty? So they rejoice when the city of Nineveh is destroyed. Now, the next prophet that we will examine is Habakkuk. And Habakkuk is different from any of the other prophecies in the Old Testament. It isn't a message necessarily from God to the people, but it is a conversation between Habakkuk and the Lord. Habakkuk has problems, and he wants answers to these problems. So he is talking directly with Yahweh to find out why the punishment has not come on his own people, because they are so wicked. Now, in Habakkuk, God is just in dealing with the nations. Judah was to receive punishment from the Babylonian, who would in turn be punished by God. This is one of the problems that Habakkuk has. His first problem is, why aren't you punishing these people of Judah who are so sinful? And then when God gives him the answer, then he has a problem with the Babylonians, who are a very cruel people. And then, even when the world events are confusing, we need to trust God and act with integrity. This is a very important message, even for us today. When everything around us seems to be going to the dogs, then we are supposed to use our integrity and stay true to God. Now, the purpose of the book of Habakkuk is to examine the issue of God's justice on a national plane. The question at hand in the theodicy, that is the justification of God's ways with humanity, is how can a just God use a wicked nation like Babylon as his instrument for punishment? And the major theme in the book is God's policy for handling nations. And in the same way that God appears at the end of the book of Job in the storm, Habakkuk 3 portrays the arrival of the glory of God's presence to carry out judgment. The psalm is introduced in the last verse in chapter 2. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. The book of Habakkuk is written about 640 BC. And you have these three discourses. The first is Habakkuk's complaint, and that is in chapter 1, verse 2. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, their strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Now that is the call that we have today. Our nation, founded on principles of God's law, is now so sinful, we ask the question, God, how can it get any worse than it is? Why don't you bring judgment upon the people? Well, he's going to give us the same answer that he gave to Habakkuk. The discourse 2 is the responsibility of the righteous, and it's almost hidden in what he says. The answer of the Lord begins with verse 5 of chapter 1, and he says, Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong, their horsemen come from afar. They fly like a vulture, swooping to devour. They all come bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They deride kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. They build earthen ramps and capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own strength is their God. That is the description of the Babylonians, and they're going to be almost as bad as the Assyrians. Habakkuk has a problem. Lord, how are you going to use a more evil people to punish a less evil people? Now here I should pause and point out that when we speak about the evil of the Babylonians and the evil of the house of Judah, we must remember that Judah had God revealing his will to them. So when we speak about more evil and less evil. We do it in the sense that those with revelation are as guilty as the Babylonians who are without revelation. We need to keep that in mind, that we who call ourselves Christians need to recognize that we have had God's revelation given to us, and what we do is often worse than what others do who have no revelation. But in this case, he has a problem with these ruthless Babylonians. And so he says in verse 1 of chapter 2, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. So Habakkuk says, I'm willing to wait and see, and then I will make a proper decision. And then we have the Lord's answer. He says, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. Now this may have the idea too that you write it large enough so that a person running by can read it, but you are to make it clear so that anyone who wants to can read this message. And it says in verse 3, for the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. And then he begins to describe the Babylonians. And within this, there is a small phrase that is so important. In verse 4, see, he is puffed up, his desires are not upright. Now that's talking about the Babylonians. But within that statement, he says, but the righteous will live by his faith, or by his faithfulness, and that is so important. Even though he goes on to speak about how wicked the Babylonians are, that statement is the truth that needs to be heralded to everyone. The righteous will live by his faith. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are around us. The person who knows God will exercise his integrity and remain true to him. And this is what Paul picks up in the New Testament, where he speaks about the righteous will live by their faith. He puts it in a little bit different context, but this is where he picks it up, that the righteous will live by his faith. And then it goes on to speak about the Babylonians and what they are going to do. And then in his discourse 3, we have mercy and trust. And this is going to come in the prayer of Habakkuk in chapter 3. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, O Lord. Renew them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Now, Habakkuk knows what God has done in the past. And he is saying, repeat what you have done, but be sure that you show mercy in the wrath that comes on those who are disobedient. And then we have the approach of God described beginning with verse 3. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. Plague went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled, and the age-old hills collapsed. His ways are eternal. But you notice that the earth is not eternal. When he appears, it dissolves as a result of his appearance. And I should call attention to, I saw the tents of Cushan in distress, the dwellings of Midian in anguish. There is a passage in the Old Testament where Aaron and Miriam are criticizing Moses, and it said they are doing it because he had married a Cushite. Now this passage here in verse 7 equates Cushan and Midian. This is in parallelism. So they're talking about the wife that Moses had married, who is the first wife, the only wife that he married. In verse 16 of chapter 3, I heard, and my heart pounded, my lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones, and my legs trembled. And this is where Habakkuk gives us his own trust in God. He says, yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. Even though he doesn't see evidence around him of prosperity, he says, I trust that God will provide that prosperity. Verse 19, the sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on the heights. So this is a psalm that expresses Habakkuk's trust in the mercy of God. And it's interesting in this chapter in the textbook that there is the analogy of a scale that is spoken of in looking at the evil that is committed and the way in which God punishes that evil, whether it is the nation of Babylon or the nation of Judah. It doesn't make any difference. The analogy is that of a scale. And this is where you have the scale where you put material on one side or the other side. And the evil goes on one side and the good goes on the other. And when there is so much evil that it is weighed down and touches, then God brings judgment. Now, it is possible for good to be done, and that will raise the scale because the other side is weighed with good deeds. But this is a good way of looking at the way in which God judges nations. And this is talking about nations and not individuals. And in this analogy, we could also say that to whom much is given, much is required. So the more you know, the more responsible you are for acting in the right way. Now let's turn to the book of Zephaniah. And this is the last prophet that we'll be looking at in this unit. And we're talking about the coming of the day of the Lord and the call to the humble to seek the Lord and the universal impact of the coming judgment. The purpose of the prophecy of Zephaniah was to initiate change in Judah by pronouncing God's judgment on wickedness. Coupled with God's intention to punish came the proclamation of his intention to restore Judah. The message of Zephaniah was focused on the day of the Lord, which he contended was fast approaching. The prophet contrasts the injustice in Jerusalem to the righteousness of God's presence within her. He looks to a time when they will again experience the Lord's protection and deliverance. The Lord your God is with you. He is mighty to save. We're talking about the great day of the Lord in the prophecy of Zephaniah. And this superinscription that we have at the beginning gives us the date for Zephaniah. It says it's the word of the Lord that came to Zephaniah, son of Cushi, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah. So it is thought that Zephaniah was a descendant of the great king Hezekiah. And this was during the reign of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah. Josiah was the other king other than Hezekiah, who was very good in the actions that he took in trying to establish the worship of God throughout the kingdom. The prophecy begins with an extreme desecration. It says, I will sweep away everything from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. And then you'll notice that he reverses the order of creation. In verse 3, I will sweep away both men and animals, and they were created on day 6. I will sweep away the birds of the air, and they were created on day 4, and the fish of the sea also on that day. The wicked will have only heaps of rubble when I cut off man from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. So there is a universal destruction that is going to take place. First, we are told it is about Judah. We have judgment for Judah for idolatry, and this is often the crime that they commit, that they turn away from Yahweh and they worship false gods. In verse 4, I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all who live in Jerusalem. I will cut off from this place every remnant of Baal. The names of the pagan and the idolatrous priests, those who bow down on the housetops to worship the starry host, those who bow down and swear by Yahweh, but who also swear by Moloch. This is assimilation of other religions along with the true worship of Yahweh. Those who turn back from following the Lord and neither seek the Lord nor inquire of him. Be silent before the sovereign Lord, for the day of the Lord is near. And day of the Lord here means judgment. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated those he has invited. On the day of the Lord's sacrifice, I will punish the princes and the king's sons and all those clad in foreign clothes, those who have adopted the ways of other nations. On that day I will punish all who avoid stepping on the threshold, talking about the Philistine worship, when Dagon was down on his face before the Ark of the Covenant. And it says then they put him back up, and then the next day he had fallen down and his hands and his head had broken off. So they did not step on the threshold. Who filled the temple of their gods with violence and deceit. On that day, and of course this is talking about the day of the Lord, declares the Lord, a cry will go up from the fish gate, wailing from the new quarter, and a loud crash from the hills. Wail, you who live in the market district. All your merchants will be wiped out. All who trade with silver will be ruined. At that time I will search Jerusalem with lamps and punish those who are complacent, who are like wine left on its dregs, who think the Lord will do nothing, either good or bad. You notice that the description here involves those who worship other gods and then those who are just complacent. They say, God doesn't see what we're doing, so we don't need to worry about it. And you wonder how many today still have that same idea, that I belong to God and He really doesn't pay any attention to what I do, so I'm safe. No, we have to adhere to what Zephaniah says. God is aware of this. He knows what's going on. And the great day of the Lord is mentioned in verse 14. The great day of the Lord is near and coming quickly. Listen, the cry on the day of the Lord will be bitter, the shouting of the warrior there. That day will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of trouble and ruin, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness, a day of trumpet and battle cry, against the fortified cities and against the corner towers. This is the same description as is used in other prophets as they speak about the day of the Lord, that it is the day when God will punish Judah for their sins. And it's going to be a dreadful day. So he calls on the people to repent. And you can see this in chapter 2. Gather together, O shameful nation, since the appointed time arrives. And that day sweeps on like chaff. Before the fierce anger of the Lord comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's wrath comes upon you, seek the Lord, all you humble of the land. Seek righteousness. Seek humility. Perhaps you will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. And then it goes on to speak about several nations. We have Philistia mentioned in verse 4, where Gaza is mentioned. And then Moab and Ammon in verse 8. Cush in verse 12. And Assyria in verse 13. But then you also have the indictment against Judah and Jerusalem. In chapter 3, verse 1, woe to the city of oppressors, rebellious and defiled. She obeys no one. She accepts no correction. She does not trust in the Lord. She does not draw near to her God. Her officials are roaring lions. Her rulers are evening wolves who leave nothing for the morning. Her prophets are arrogant. They are treacherous men. Of course, these are the false prophets, and we see them again and again in Israel. They have created a condition that has turned the people away from Yahweh. And it says, her priests profane the sanctuary and do violence to the law. The Lord within her is righteous. He does no wrong. Morning by morning he dispenses his justice, and every new day he does not fail. Yet the unrighteous know no shame. And so God is going to have to change the attitude of the people. that this is something that has been throughout the prophetic history, where the prophet is normally one who indicts the people for their sins and tells them that they need to change their ways and come back to God. So in verse 14, "Sing, O daughter of Zion, shout aloud, O Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away your punishment. He has turned back your enemy." So hopefully it is accomplished that the people are convinced they need to return to the Lord. And because in previous verses he has mentioned, like in verse 12, "But I will leave within you the meek and humble, who trust in the name of the Lord. The remnant of Israel will do no wrong. They will speak no lies, nor will deceit be found in their mouths. They will eat and lie down, and no one will make them afraid." Now with that, then you are told to sing, O daughter of Zion. Because Jerusalem is going to be restored. And we are told in verse 15, the second part of it, "The Lord, the King of Israel, is with you. Never again will you fear any harm. On that day, they will say to Jerusalem, 'Do not fear, O Zion. Do not let your hands hang limp. The Lord your God is with you. He is mighty to save. He will take great delight in you. He will quiet you with his love. He will rejoice over you with singing." And then some of the things that he is going to do to restore all of this. In verse 18, "The sorrows for the appointed feasts I will remove from you. They are a burden and a reproach to you." This is what God says in the book of Hosea, where "I'm tired of your feasts. I can't stand them. What I want is obedience." And that is what he is declaring here. In verse 19, "At that time I will deal with all who oppressed you. I will rescue the lame and gather those who have been scattered. I will give them praise and honor in every land where they were put to shame. At that time I will gather you. At that time I will bring you home." This is the restoration of the people. "I will give you honor and praise among all the peoples of the earth when I restore your fortunes before your very eyes," says the Lord. So there is a great promise that God gives through the prophet Zephaniah if the people will return to him. And this same message is what we preach today. God is ready to bless us if we turn to him.